Now we have Dr. Jeffrey Gerber with When Weight Loss Stalls. Dr. Gerber?
Thank you. I hope everybody enjoyed lunch and can stay awake for this. I really want to thank Carl and Richard for inviting me second year back to Ketofest. And this is truly a unique festival, and I hope that we see this year after year. So this is a really important topic that I'd like to discuss because it has both clinical and practical significance. And so when you look at these weight loss graphs and figures in clinical trials, they often take on this appearance of a check mark. And by that I mean in the first 6 to 12 months, you lose a maximum amount of weight, and then the weight loss levels off. You hit a plateau, and then we see the weight loss start to come back up. And that's the tail of that check mark. And so here's some examples. So this is the classic SHI study where they were comparing low carb to Mediterranean to low fat. And you can see the bottom line in the purple is the low carb diet that seems to do better than the other diets. But yet, each and every diet, the weight starts to creep back up. Here's a bariatric surgery study. And again, the gastric bypass, that big Roux-en-Y procedure, is the one where you get maximum weight loss. But again, there's that tail where the weight starts to creep back up no matter what bariatric procedure you receive. And here we have the classic Stanford A to Z weight loss study. Again, low carb wins here, but there's that check mark. The weight loss comes back up. So the question is, how can we address this? How can we maintain ideal body weight and health long term? So the first question regarding this long-term approach is low carb enough? And I'm warning you, I love pie charts. So here's your typical low carb, high fat, ketogenic diet, and we're breaking down the macronutrients. And we're using the color palette from MyFitnessPal. And there's some subliminal stuff going on here because you can see the fats in the red. So this is a typical 70% fat in the red, 20% protein in the green, 10% carbohydrate in the blue. And this diet, again, focuses on hormones, regulating insulin and satiety, not necessarily looking at calories. And then we have this paleo diet. And this one, well, you can eat a little bit more carbohydrate, a little bit more protein, a little less fat. And we always joke that the millennials, the younger generation, love this type of diet. And what we see later in life, they become diabetic. Not everyone, and I'm just kind of joking. But I think the point is that the diet that is best for you depends on where you are in life. But again, not represented here is the concept of the nutrient density and the quality of food. That's a big component of paleo diet. Then we have your typical low-fat diet where calories in, calories out is what's important. And since fat is energy dense, we're going to reduce fat intake, and in return we'll increase carbohydrate to 55% of energy. And then, again, it's just about the calories. This one's kind of funny. This is the perfectly balanced diet. And it's mathematically precise, where a third of the energy comes from each macronutrient. Can't argue with mathematical precision, can we? And then we have the protein-sparing modified fast. And this looks like a high-protein diet. And the protein sparing has been around for ages, and it really refers to sparing lean muscle mass. But what you'll see, and we'll talk about this later, is that this is actually a reduced energy or reduced calorie diet. And the last one that's poorly represented is fasting, where you don't eat anything. I don't know why you're clapping. But yeah, okay. But the idea is, looking at it this way, it's not accounting for the aspect that feeding is time restricted. And it's been shown that when you compress the time that you eat, it actually increases resting energy expenditure, just like a low-carb diet does it. But so the question is, again, long term, are we addressing with these particular macronutrient mixes and diets metabolic health, metabolic disease, hormones, satiety, and energy, and the quality of the food? All important things to consider. So we have this guy, Gary Taubes, and let's see what he says about this long-term approach. So here I am. I met him for the first time in 2011 when he came out with the second book, Why We Get Fat. I didn't know who this clown was back then, to be honest, because I had been doing this approach with my patients way back 10 years prior. But Gary comes along, and he likes a good laugh. I'm not really making fun of him, just poking him. But, I think that, in a sense, he picked up the torch from Dr. Atkins. And so, of course, what Gary says, just to briefly review, that adiposity is a hormonal disease. And the main hormone that we focus on is insulin, because it's the fat storage hormone. And so if we regulate insulin levels properly, we're going to address insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, and metabolic disease. Well, we probably all agree that Gary is mostly right. And the reason, if you look at recent data from CDC, currently 2/3 of the adult population over age 45 are diabetic, pre-diabetic, and have some form of metabolic disease. So as a general message, a blanket message across the board, that if you tell people to reduce carbohydrate in the diet, you're off to a running start. But again, is that all you need to tell them for the long term? So there's different ways to define and look at metabolic disease. And one very important aspect is that this is a disease of dysfunctional adipose tissue. So at some point, adipose tissue becomes dysfunctional. And then it releases all these inflammatory factors that ultimately lead to chronic diseases that we treat in the office every day. But important to realize, maybe you didn't know, but you can actually gain fat mass without insulin. Again, you can gain fat mass without insulin. So there's other pathways, such as GLUT2 receptors. So you have to keep that in mind. You can gain fat. There's a point where the adipose tissue becomes dysfunctional. So insulin resistance drives hunger. So as we gain fat and we become, our fat cells become dysfunctional, our insulin levels start to rise, the energy gets trapped in the fat cells and we can't tap into it. That's one way it drives appetite. There's central signals from insulin resistant that also drive appetite, and this is a vicious cycle. But look, insulin is not the only thing that drives appetite. Take a look at this. We have all these other pathways that regulate food intake. And this is perhaps a tribute to Stephan Guyenet. And he talks about food reward. But you can see that peripherally, there's signals such as insulin, leptin, gut incretins, the list goes on and on. There's central satiety signals, and all of this play into driving our appetite. Very important to consider in health and metabolic disease. And as we learn more about the hormonal milieu, I think we'll be better able to help our patients. So what happens when you treat insulin resistance? So insulin resistance is like a dam. And when those levels are high, again, energy is trapped in the fat cells and you can't access it. And so when you treat insulin resistance with a low-carb diet, you drop those insulin levels, you reverse insulin resistance, and you open the insulin floodgates. That energy comes pouring out, and the body can use it. And so there's this metabolic advantage, especially for diabetics, when you look at the pathophysiology. And this apparent high-calorie, high-fat diet seems to defy thermodynamics, but it really is not defying thermodynamics. We just have to account for the energy properly. And of course, as many of you know, the eating less is spontaneous because it just does a great job at controlling appetite. And I think really important is there's a psychologic advantage because the focus is on satiety rather than deprivation, right? We all know that. But in this model, perhaps calories don't matter. Well, here's a scenario. We have a pre-diabetic or an insulin-resistant individual. They go on this low-carb, high-fat keto diet. They lose a ton of weight. What happens? Well, they become metabolically healthy. And I assure you that if they continue to eat the way that they were eating when they started, they're going to hit that plateau and weight's going to come back up. You have to eat less. So the quantity of food is very important to consider across the board. So let's talk a little bit about the calories, see if we can make some sense. So Gary Taub asks really two great questions when it comes to this debate regarding the calories versus the insulin. The first question, are we fat because we overeat? This is in support of the CICO or the calories in, calories out model. The second question, do we overeat because we're fat? This is in support of the hormonal hypothesis. Well, guess what? This reminds me of the chicken and the egg. And while we're trying to figure out if the chicken or the egg came first, when it comes to this calorie versus insulin debate, I think we really have to consider both aspects. So on the calorie side, let's take a look at that. So this is a scientific statement paper from the Endocrine Society from a very famous obesity researcher, George Bray. It just came out this year. And here's what they say. So it starts out with positive fat balance. That's kind of a funky term. Sounds like fat in, fat out. Okay. But from there, it leads to subcutaneous fat accumulation. And then we have dysfunctional subcutaneous fat. And it flows downhill to the point that we get dysfunctional fat or ectopic fat. And if you remember, I just talked about this a minute ago. Okay? But from there, what develops is metabolic disease, hormonal dysregulation. You can't ignore this. I think there's a lot of truth in what George Bray et al. Is saying. So, rather than having this divisive conversation between these two groups, and I'm a middle of the ground guy, okay? I'm a moderate. Excuse me, I can't help myself. But what if these two schools come together and have a consensus? So on the one side, we have the calorie camp, we have the endocrine camp, and they come together in harmony, and we now have the school of food energy and metabolism. And the best part, again, it's bipartisan. Yay! I love that. We need more of that. So, in honor of this new school, I've come up with a new book title. So here it is, How We Stay Slim. Now, I plagiarized some of Gary Taub's imagery there. And he said I could as long as I had a shout out to Gary, so thank you, Gary. But this is the real challenge, how we stay slim and maintain ideal body weight for life. And what we propose is that we combine this endocrine and the calorie-centric axes into one. And to understand and to agree that hormones and calories are both important. But the CICO, calories in, calories out model is just too simplistic. So let's take a few minutes and see if we can expand on that. So we have calories in, calories out, and as most of you know, it's based on the first law of thermodynamics. And they put organic material into the bomb calorimeter. And it's a closed system, and they combust the organic material, the temperature rises, and you can determine how much energy are released from different organic materials. So then they wanted to take it a step further and figure out what was going on in living beings, humans. And so, look, they they discovered this, the metabolic chamber. Now what's different is you're measuring in the metabolic chamber cellular respiration, which is a slow biochemical process that uses the energy. And you start to measure different things, not only temperature, but oxygen in, CO2 out, water. You can put the individual inside and exercise them, and measures things like respiratory quotient, VO2, aerobic threshold, substrate oxidation. And all of a sudden you see that energy is being processed differently in different individuals. That's the interesting part. But what's true, calories in equals calories out. It doesn't matter where you are in the world or in the universe. It's a law of thermodynamics. But the body isn't interested in balancing some energy equation. It's interested in processing the energy. So rather than call it calories in and calories out, I like the idea of calling it energy in and energy out. And again, the interesting part is the processing of the energy. Lots of things are happening. Guess what? That energy gets the choice to be partitioned or not, meaning that energy can be directly used or energy can be stored. Also, the body has a choice whether it can use the stored energy or not. And then most important is feedback. And so feedback is a common pathway in any biologic system. And it regulates this whole process. And that's very important to think about. Two examples of feedback and signaling are satiety and hormones, of course. So that's the interesting part, the energy processing. And then just to review, so we have nutrient partitioning to think about. Again, the energy coming in, can it be used? Can it be stored? Can the body tap into that stored energy or can it not? Again, the feedback and the signaling. Satiety hormones are great examples, and there's umpteen other pathways that we need to think about. When it comes to satiety, what are the most satiating foods? And I think if you're insulin resistant or diabetic, some combination of protein and fat, low carb, really good. But if you're metabolically normal, guess what? Carbohydrates can fill you up also. So it's different for everybody. What about the thermal effect of food? Did you know that when you eat protein, 25% of the energy goes into actually processing and digesting it, whereas fat and carb only requires 15%. What about nutrient-dense food versus processed food? It takes more energy to process a nutrient-dense, unprocessed food. What about energy output? Can you increase resting energy expenditure? Well, it turns out that we can actually give off heat through brown adipose tissue uncoupling protein. And there's another way that we can give off energy. We measure ketones in the blood. We measure ketones, especially in the urine and in the breath. And so we breathe off ketones, we pee off ketones, and they're actually high energy. And so we talk about wasting energy, but in a state when somebody is metabolically healthy and we start increasing resting energy expenditure in this way, I think it's actually correcting metabolic disease rather than simply wasting energy. We can also use it to keep our bodies warm. And also, if you increase your muscle mass over time, that also increases resting energy expenditure. So isn't that fascinating? All these things that we have to consider. It's the processing of the energy. So now for a little clinical, since I'm a physician, if you don't mind. So when patients come to see us in the office, we break them down into 4 body types. So we have the insulin sensitive groups, and we have the insulin resistant groups. So the insulin sensitive groups, we hate that person on the left, the slim, metabolically healthy, metabolically flexible, you know, they can eat anything they want, they never get sick, they live forever. We hate that group. Now, it's interesting, when we see a person, it's just a snapshot in time, so it could change for them. And then on the right is a very interesting type. This is the insulin sensitive but overweight individual. And I was talking to one of the attendees a couple minutes ago about this. So they actually build up a lot of subcutaneous fat, but yet when you measure them metabolically inside, they're completely healthy. You measure their insulin, you do a 2-hour glucose test with insulin, you do inflammatory markers, you do lipid profile, it's all normal. And guess what? You put them on a low-carb, high-fat keto diet, often nothing happens. They want a refund. They are not happy with this. And so what's really important to understand in this particular scenario is that, again, the quantity, controlling appetite are factors that we really need to consider. So they're overweight, and it's not necessarily an insulin problem. I think that's really interesting. Now, we actually see more women who fit this category. So it's a smaller percentage of people compared to the ones that are insulin resistant, but it's a very important group. And you need to recognize that a keto diet doesn't necessarily work for everybody. So then we have the insulin resistant groups. And on the left, we have these individuals, they don't gain a lot of fat, and they become diabetic at the drop of a hat. And these are these TOFI individuals where they're thin on the outside, fat on the inside. Typically, a lot of Asians fit this pattern. And then on the right, we have the classic type 2 diabetic, overweight, metabolically unhealthy, and those two groups, you put them on a low-carb keto diet, and invariably they have great success. But the question again is, low-carb keto, all you have to do long-term? No, because things change for them. Now, just to illustrate the difference between these two overweight groups, the slide is a bit extreme, but here we go. We have on the left, and I have to thank Marty Kendall from Brisbane, Australia for this. So we have a guy on the left who's insulin sensitive but overweight, and so he carries subcutaneous fat predominantly. And then we have the individual on the right, the beer belly, typical beer belly, tons of visceral fat, and this guy's metabolically unhealthy. But as you know, it's not this extreme. There's really a spectrum of insulin resistance. And when we see people in the office, we need to approach in this perspective, trying to figure out where the individual lies on this insulin spectrum. And so it can change. So depending on your age, your activity level, your particular diet, where you are in your diet, you can move forward and backwards on this insulin spectrum. And that's how I think about it every day. So why is it that we have these 4 different body types? And personal fat threshold really explains this nicely. And personal fat threshold simply defines how much subcutaneous fat an individual can store before the subcutaneous fat cells become absolutely full and they say, nope, I can't handle any more fat. And so at this point, we see ectopic fat start to form because the body needs to store this energy. So then the fat starts to spill over into the visceral fat and then the organ fat. So I'm going to show you some examples. So as you see the fat grow, this is a great example of those TOFI individuals where they can put on just a little bit of fat, it becomes dysfunctional, and it starts spilling over into the organ fat, the visceral fat, and they become diabetic. Then we have other groups where the subcutaneous fat can continue to build and build, and they hit their threshold. And then we have perhaps this third group where they can store even more fat, and they hit the threshold. But in all 3 groups, at some point, the adipose, the subcutaneous fat, is filled up. It actually becomes dysfunctional, and then we see ectopic fat. So there's ectopic fat starting in the viscera around the organs. Well, guess what? That fills up as well. and the system says, uh-oh, what are we going to do? So the next place it can go is into the organs. So we get organ fat, we get fatty liver disease, and then that fills up. We're inflamed. We are really in trouble. What do? There's not much. Inflammation is building. We see inflammation in the blood vessels. The next thing we know, we have a heart attack, and you're dead. So not a happy, fun scenario, but that basically describes the personal fat threshold. Now, I think clinically, if we can learn to predict into the future what is your personal fat threshold, that will really guide us in terms of both diet and lifestyle. Excellent stuff. So now I want to switch gears and talk about aging gracefully. And that brings us to the mitochondria and cellular respiration. And why does aging happen here? Because in the mitochondria, we process energy, and it leads to oxidative stress. Now, I have to warn you, I never thought that after medical school, the stuff I'm going to talk to you about will come back to haunt me. But I tell you, it really has clinical and practical relevance. Let me explain. So we have the fuel mixture that comes in. And again, it's fat, carbohydrate, and protein, and it goes through these common pathways, succinate acetyl-CoA, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, and all along the way, it produces energy as ATP. In the electron transport chain, we use oxygen. Without oxygen, none of this works. You drop dead without oxygen. So every living animal needs oxygen. So looking at fat, the fatty acid first goes through a process known as beta oxidation, where that long chain is cleaved off. Then it's transferred to acetyl-CoA, and it runs through the citric acid cycle. Now, in a state of low glucose, low insulin, or fasting, the liver does something interesting where not only are you getting free-running acetyl-CoA from fatty acids, but in addition, some of that acetyl-CoA gets converted to ketones. And then that can be transported to the blood. It's a high-energy molecule and used in specific organs, including the brain, the heart, the muscle, and the kidney. You must not forget that triglyceride has a glycerol backbone. And glycerol is essentially glucose. So in a state where there's not much glucose coming in, you have glycerol. So you're actually using the glucose pathways when you're burning triglyceride. And then, of course, we have carbohydrate. It goes through glycolysis, runs through, produces energy. We have protein. Protein can be used for energy, but we more think of it as a building block. So here you have the substrate, the fuel mixture coming in. It gets transferred through the cell membrane into the cytosol. We have glucose that can runs through glycolysis. In a state of low oxygen, you also see fermentation, which is actually an inefficient way to produce energy, but it does serve a purpose. And then the energy is transported into the mitochondria, and in the mitochondria, we see the production of ATP. Why ATP? I don't know. That's how the system works. But ATP is the high energy source that the cells use in the body. When that third phosphate bond is cleaved, it releases energy, and that energy is transferred to all the cellular processes, including mechanical, kinetic things like muscles, breathing, your heart pumping, going to the bathroom, whatever you want. This is how the system works. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the mitochondria. And I'd like to very simply, hopefully, explain oxidative phosphorylation. And we're looking at the inner mitochondrial membrane. But what you're really looking at is a battery and a motor. I think that's really easy to understand, perhaps. So you have the energy, the substrate coming in to the mitochondria, and that energy gets transferred to these coenzymes called NADH and FADH2. And from there, the hydrogen protons and electrons are donated to this electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is this battery that I just mentioned. So what happens, the electrons in the yellow actually run right in the membrane itself, all the way through, and at the other side it gets accepted by oxygen. Again, this is all dependent on oxygen. You have to have oxygen. So those electrons generate energy, and these complexes, 1, 2, 3, 4, uses that energy to pump these hydrogen protons across this membrane. And what's happening is you're creating more protons on one side than the other. That's an electrochemical gradient. That's a battery. Even I can understand that. And maybe other healthcare professionals. I can poke at them because I am one. So like any battery, it wants to discharge itself. So how does it do that? There's several ways that it can do it, but really the most important, if you look at the substance on the right, or the complex over on the right, we think of this as a tiny electrochemical motor. It's called ATP synthase. Some people also refer to that as complex 5. But through a process known as chemiosmosis, these hydrogen protons literally fly through ATP synthase, and ATP synthase spins, and it spits out ATP. There's your energy right there. And this is a schematic video of ATP synthase spinning and spitting out those ATP. Now, it's amazing. This is occurring in every single cell in our body, with the exception of red blood cells. They don't really have mitochondria. But it produces your body weight in ATP per day. And if this stops, within seconds, your cells are dead and you're dead. So this is where it's really important. Now, this is my key point. I'd like to explain to you that there's 2 ways to charge this battery. There's a rapid charge and a slow charge. The rapid being glucose and the slow charge being fat. So we have an individual who's being primarily fueled by glucose coming from bread, for example. Now, when that glucose comes in, it runs through glycolysis, citric acid cycle, comes into the electron transport chain, and it turns out that the majority of the energy from that glucose is transferred to NADH. What happens to NADH? Well, it predominantly runs through this complex 1, the electrons and the protons. Complex 1 is a high energy state. And as you move down the electron transport chain, the energy drops in each complex as the gradient is getting larger and larger. But what's important is that complex 1 is this high energy state. So the electron and the hydrogen protons especially are rapidly flowing through. And I have a background in ham radio when I was a kid. And we had to study electronics, and this is where I really connect to this stuff. But when you have in electricity a circuit like this, where it's high energy, it's equivalent to a high voltage, high current, and high power circuit. So that's complex 1. That's the rapidly charging option. So now let's look what happens to fat, and saturated fat in particular. So here we have pure fat, perhaps some bacon that you're eating. And as I said before, saturated fat, those long fatty acid chains, they have to run through beta oxidation before they go through the citric acid cycle. Well, it turns out beta oxidation produces quite a bit of FADH2. In fact, half of the energy is transferred as FADH2. Now, what happens with FADH2? Well, it predominantly goes through this complex 2. And I wish they could represent it better, but you can see it's tucked away underneath, on the underside of the membrane, but you see it doesn't run through the membrane. And the point there is that the electrons are kind of flowing through, but the hydrogen protons don't go through at complex 2. The hydrogen protons, pass through the membrane at a lower energy state going through complex 3 and 4. And so therefore, when fat comes in, it's equivalent to this slow charging option. I hope you're with me. Does that make sense? Whew. Okay. It's pretty easy from here, but let me just review. So again, glucose rapidly charges the gradient. And this really is analogous to heating a battery. And everybody knows you have a cell phone, and you always want the rapid charger because we're on the run, we want to get on with our lives. So we grab the rapid charger. I just got a new phone that has the wireless charge, and that thing heats up like crazy. Not only the battery, but the charger. And that rapid charge that we're talking about is really equivalent to glucose increasing oxidative stress. Whereas saturated fat, again, is the slow charging option. And that as a fuel source tends to decrease oxidative stress. And I tell you, the mechanisms support this, but in a sense, it is a hypothesis on my behalf. I think the other thing that's really important to understand, we all know that saturated fat has more energy per gram, 9 kcals versus 4 kcals on carb and protein. But the point here, if you understand this, is that it really is saturated fat that delivers more safe energy. I think that's really fascinating. Now, protein's somewhere in the middle, so you can't really make a distinction when protein comes in here. So we got through that. So this reminds me of the tortoise and the hare. That's an early version of Bugs Bunny, I think. So the question, though, the race is who's going to age more gracefully. So, of course, the hare wants to win the race, and that person chooses glucose as the fuel. And again, the hare really wants to win the race. So he'll add maybe a little caffeine, maybe some nicotine to the mix, and yes, some anabolic steroid. So the hare has made a mixture of nitromethane. Imagine the oxidative stress. And then, of course, we have the tortoise. And the tortoise chooses the safe fuel, fatty acid. And so I would say it's your choice in life as to the way you want to fuel your body and your mitochondria. But it certainly is fair to say that longevity is an endurance sport. That's the punchline. So, we've been talking about oxidative stress, and that brings us to free radicals. Now, when we talk about free radicals, we're not talking about flower children. We're not talking about conscientious objectors. We're talking about these unpaired electrons in the mitochondria. They're charged particles, okay? And I was showing you all those hydrogen, protons, and electrons. It's charged particles. It's actually a natural process, and we have antioxidants that take care of this at physiologic dosage. At physiologic levels, rather. But the problem is when oxidative stress gets out of hand. We also see reactive oxygen species, and all these free radicals and charged particles can potentially interact with the body in a bad way. Now, by definition, oxidative stress means that free radicals, these uncharged electrons, are out of control. And that's really a bad thing. So it does all kinds of bad things, especially in the mitochondria. And this is why we think of this as the area where aging occurs, in particular in our cells. So on the left, you have your healthy mitochondria, where they're producing lots of ATP and there's very small free radical concentration. On the right, we have the unhealthy ATP, and we have the unhealthy mitochondria that's producing very little ATP and lots of free radicals. And so we want to keep our mitochondria healthy. And it turns out, again, feedback and signaling, the body has a method of keeping mitochondria healthy, replicating mitochondria. turning over mitochondria, producing more mitochondria, keeping the production of ATP elevated. So I mentioned again this electrical chemical charge in the gradient and how you fuel the mitochondria can determine the health or not. But it turns out at a more physiologic level of these free radicals, it provides signaling and feedback. So actually, reactive oxygen species, reverse electron transport, very fascinating stuff. Mike Eads gave a talk about that in our Breckenridge conference, can actually provide signaling, tell the cell again which fuel to use and to stay healthy. And Jeff Volek wrote a great paper with his group about mitohormesis, and I have the link on the bottom, and I encourage you to take a look at that study. So that's an overview of mitochondria and how you want to fuel your mitochondria for life. So we're just a few more slides. We're going to bring it back around to the clinical aspect and where we started at the beginning. And I'd like to explain to you how a protein-sparing modified fast is quite similar to a low-carb, high-fat diet. So this chart is revealing somebody on a low-carb, high-fat diet, perhaps a diabetic or a pre-diabetic. And so the individual is consuming 50 grams of protein, 100 grams of, 50 grams of carbohydrate, 100 grams of protein, 160 grams of fat, for a total of 2,000 calories. Typical low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet. Now, generally, as people go along, their appetites has controlled, as we talked about this, and they end up naturally eating less. Now, for illustrative purposes, I just want to show you that in general, people tend to keep their carb and protein the same, but they actually reduce the fat intake. And so this individual over time is reducing fat intake. But what's interesting here is we're now accounting for the fact that that individual is going to tap into fat stores and use their own fat stores in adipose tissue for energy. So there it is right there. And when you get to the end of the chart, that individual is still using 160 grams of fat for energy. The carb stays the same, the protein stays the same, the calories are the same. To me, that looks like a ketogenic diet. But now let's look at this another way. And here, we're not accounting for body fat that's being used for energy. And this is like a protein-sparing modified fast. The carbohydrate and the protein are still the same. But now it's only 60 grams of fat. If you add that all up, the calories are 1,140. Also, you might note that the percentage from protein and carbohydrate went up. So it looks like a high-protein diet, which is protein-sparing modified fast. But I don't care what you call this. You can call this keto, protein-sparing modified fast. The point that we're trying to make is that long-term, it's important to think about the quantity of food so you don't hit that plateau and you don't start regaining weight. So this is my consensus statement, steps to a healthier life. And just real brief, most of you are familiar with these. So you want to limit processed food, especially sugar, grain, probably starch if you're diabetic, and those industrial seed oils. You want to eat real food, nutrient-dense food, and as Dr. Ben Bickman uses alliteration, and I love this, he says to control carbohydrate, prioritize protein, fill with fat. That's awesome. If it's working right, you're going to naturally eat less. But again, in some people, you have to think specifically about the quantity of food. Again, finding the right protein and fat mix is probably best. I think a little metabolic confusion is also interesting. So you mix things up. Sometimes you mix the macronutrients, and then this is long-term. Maybe throw in a little intermittent fasting after exercise, do things with your macronutrients. But again, long term, the hope is that you become more metabolically healthy, and so you have to think about doing things like this. Supplements need to be considered. Stress, sleep, and sunlight. The stress and sleep issue can just shut the whole system down. And then movement and activity. So there's cardiovascular benefits, there's psychologic benefits. And again, we talked about if you increase your lean muscle mass, that's going to increase your resting energy expenditure. So we're going to end with one of my favorite cartoons. And the caption reads, FDA to retool food guide pyramid, citing consumer confusion. Well, yes, we're confused if these guidelines are making us sick and turning us into food pyramids. And so it's our hope as we move into the future that these guidelines can follow the scientific evidence. Thanks for your time.